welcome to our third bonus episode, Sir Sean Connery.
On today's episode, we're going to talk about Sir Sean Connery, the original James Bond, or maybe the OG James Bond, as the kids would say. We're going to release a special bonus episode on each of the actors that played Bond in the Eon film franchise. So let's get into this first one about Sean.
Yeah, so firstly we're going to talk a bit about the bio, and I suppose, Andy, this is something you probably put on a dating profile in this little section. So name at birth was Thomas Connery, named after his paternal grandfather. He was born on the 25th of August 1930. If you believe in star signs, Sir Sean Connery is a Virgo. Place of birth, Edinburgh, Scotland. And he died on the 31st of October 2020, aged 90 years old.
Quite a full life he's lived. A bit more about his personal life. Just the one child, who you may know, that would be Jason Connery. He's an actor and director in his own right. Featured in various theatre, film, TV show productions. Interestingly, he portrayed Ian Fleming in the TV film Spy Maker, The Secret Life of Ian Fleming. So a little bit of a connection there. Sean has one sibling, Neil Connery. Neil Connery made his film debut in the 1967 film OK Connery, which was retitled to Operation Kid Brother in the US. The film itself features several actors from the Bond franchise, including Daniela Bianchi, who played Tatiana Romanova, Adolfo Celli, apologies for the mispronunciation, who played Emilio Largo, and also Lois Maxwell, who played Miss Moneypenny, and Bernard Lee, who you may remember as M.
And it's actually, Andy, I'm just going to go off script. I find it fascinating that Sean Connery's child and his brother has played or has featured or has a relationship with James Bond in kind of filming credits.
It's really interesting that they would be so accepting of it, because I guess there could be a tendency to shun away from the thing that made your dad or brother famous because you want to make your own name in the world, but they seem to have embraced it, which is it's quite nice. I like that.
Yeah, I do. So he was married twice, to Diane and Micheline, and he was married to Micheline, so apologies for mispronouncing that if I have, until Connery's death. And Sean is his middle name and was called by his middle name by some of his friends when growing up. And Connery liked this and preferred to be called by Sean instead of his first name.
So at the age of 16, Connery joined the Royal Navy, but he was medically discharged at age 19. Had several jobs after leaving the Navy. Lorry driver, lifeguard, labourer, coffin polisher, and a model for an artist. So various ways to earn his keep before he got into acting.
Yeah, I was telling the wife when we were researching this about how varied his early career was. And I wonder how, in terms of that time, how many actors had that kind of varied career before they kind of made it, or I suppose before they decided to try, their hand at acting.
Yeah, it's interesting because you hear or see stories of kind of out of work actors or actors trying to make it, even today, where there's the kind of the stereotype that they work in a coffee shop whilst they're auditioning for roles. I guess like Joey and Friends for a bit. He had a job in the coffee shop for a while. But I wonder how different it was back in Connery's day. So this would be what, 50s, when he was trying to start out, versus how it is today, where I guess you could argue it would be more professional these days, or certainly more scrutiny. But so is it easier to get into acting? Is it more difficult to get into acting? I don't know. That's probably another question for another show.
Well, I was going to say, you could look at it either way. Because you've got social media, you're more accessible, but obviously the competition is greater.
Yeah, social media is that double-edged sword, isn't it? Because everyone can be famous by having social media. So, yeah, you're right. Very, very interesting. We'll park that and maybe come back to it at a future discussion.
So Connery started bodybuilding at 18 and worked backstage in theatre. He also worked as an extra and got some roles in several theatre productions and various small TV parts. In 1957, Connery landed his first film role and went on to feature in 3 more films in 1957 and also some TV roles.
On set, once Connery was confronted by a co-star's gangster boyfriend, and the boyfriend pulled a gun out on Connery. Connery disarmed him and the police was called. I thought that was quite an interesting little tidbit into one of his early forays into the acting world. But then, of course, soon after that came James Bond. Initially, Connery was reluctant to commit to a film series, but obviously he then understood that if the film succeeded, he would have a greatly benefited career.
And Connery obviously played James Bond 6 times in the official franchise, and as you know, if you listen to our main podcast, we cover each of these films. But he also played Bond in Never Say Never Again, which we are hoping to include as a bonus episode in the future, aren't we, Andy?
Indeed we are. Watch this space.
And Dana Broccoli, wife of Cubby Broccoli, was believed to have been instrumental in persuading her husband that Connery was the right man. And interestingly, Ian Fleming as well originally doubted Sean Connery's casting, saying he's not what I envisioned of James Bond looks. I'm looking for a Commander Bond and not an overgrown stuntman, adding that Connery, who's obviously muscular, 6'2", and the Scot was unrefined. And I think we touched on that, didn't we, Andy, when we, maybe in Doctor No, I can't quite remember in terms of the actual main podcast, but I'm sure we did touch on that Ian Fleming did have his doubts.
We did. I certainly remember talking to you about that. Whether we did that on air or off, I'm not sure, but we definitely discussed that, and the part his wife played in persuading him that he's from Midstay. But yeah, could have been very different if Fleming had have said no. So the thing that made Fleming change his mind was the successful Doctor No premiere. He was so impressed that he actually wrote Connery's heritage into the character, and this is something I didn't realise. I was under the impression that Bond was always Scottish, and Connery was picked because he was Scottish in some way. But actually, in the 1964 novel, You Only Live Twice, that's where Fleming wrote that Bond's father was Scottish and from Glencoe in the Scottish Highlands. So that's 2 years after Connery had started portraying Bond on film.
Definitely, and you obviously mentioned before, Andy, haven't you, about James Bond being from Scotland or having Scottish parents in the previous episode.
Yeah, and like I said, I just assumed that was always the thing, but we owe his Scottish roots to Connery rather than the other way around. Connery's portrayal of Bond owes a lot to the stylistic coaching from the director Terence Young. He helped him polish him whilst using his physical presence for the action. Lois Maxwell, who played Moneypenny, of course, she's quoted as saying, Terence took Sean under his wing. He took him to dinner, showed him how to walk, how to talk, even how to eat.
It's kind of like Terence Young has adopted Sean Connery, isn't it? In terms of doing all the things there, and obviously it worked well. So what we're going to do now, we're going to recap on the Rating Room's rankings for the Connery film. So we've obviously released this bonus episode after the 6 films that Sean Connery is featured in. So listeners of our main podcast will probably recall our rankings for the Sean Connery films, but we're just going to go over it again just to kind of remind everyone. So Andy, I'm just going to go first. So in order, starting from 1, I ranked Goldfinger 9 out of 10. Then From Russia With Love, 8 out of 10. Thunderball, 7 out of 10. Doctor No, 7 out of 10. You Only Live Twice, 6 out of 10. And then at the bottom of my pile for Sean Connery was Diamonds Are Forever. So out of a possible 60 points, I suppose you could say, I've given the Sean Connery films 42. So I think that's very respectable, and that's an average of 7 out of 10. So again, I think that is a respectable score, 7 out of 10. Andy, do you just want to remind our listeners how you ranked the Sean Connery Bond films?
Indeed. So for regular listeners, you'll know that Jay and I don't always agree on films, on Bond girls, on villains. But in terms of the order of Connery films, we've actually got the exact same order. But we do have slight variances in the score. So I'll run mine 1 to 6, which will be the same order as Jay, but the score's slightly different. So I liked Goldfinger best, and I also gave that 9 out of 10. Then From Russia With Love, which I gave only a 7 rather than 8. Then Thunderball, I gave 6 out of 10. Doctor No, I gave 6 out of 10. You Only Live Twice, I gave 6 out of 10. Followed by Diamonds Are Forever, 5 out of 10. So I've been a little bit harsher in some of my ratings there. So 39 out of 60 total for an average of 6.5, but still quite a respectable start to the franchise, I would say.
Andy, obviously, when we started watching these and like you said, the rankers are obviously in the same order. The scoring is just like, kind of a small variance there. I must admit, thinking back to when we first started the podcast, I was thinking, oh no, we've both got very similar tastes. There's not going to be much disagreement. But then, obviously, as we progress through the season 1, we start seeing that variance. And, from memory, I'd say that's probably kicked in the Roger Moore stage of, the Roger Moore era.
I agree. I think that's when some of our opinions started to differ and we got into full-on fight mode. We didn't, of course. We keep things civil on the podcast, but we had some differences of opinion and some good debate. But I think it probably, in some ways, goes to the strength of Connery that we both hold him in such high regard, and in a similar way. So I think that probably says more about Connery than it does about our individual tastes.
Yeah, and if obviously the James Bond franchise, as it kicked off with Dr. No, the first film in the franchise, if Sean Connery if they didn't cast the James Bond character correctly, then obviously the franchise could have fizzled out straight away. So I think it's definitely helped the franchise as a whole by having that very strong opening with Connery. Obviously, he left and then he came back again. But, those 6 films was definitely a very strong opening in the franchise.
Absolutely, I agree. But of course, the Bond franchise was not the only thing he worked on. Starred in several films while still involved in the franchise, including Marnie in 1964, which was an Alfred Hitchcock film, and in Sidney Lumet's The Hill in 1965.
Yeah, so this is the first time in the podcast where we're talking about non-James Bond films as well, isn't it? So I think it is, for me, I'm quite looking forward to this next section because it's a bit of variance, a bit different. We're not talking about just all James Bond. We're talking, this is an opportunity to talk about the other roles that the actors are doing. So I'm quite looking forward to this section.
Yeah, we're going Bond adjacent here, aren't we? That's what we're doing.
Yeah. So Connery appeared in The Man Who Would Be King in 1975, opposite friend Michael Caine. He also appeared in The Wind and the Lion in 1975, and a year later he played Robin Hood in Robin and Marion. Yeah,
I'm going to list a few more that he's been in as well, so some of these you may be familiar with, listeners out there. So he was in Highlander, The Untouchables, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, The Hunt for Red October, The Rock, Entrapment.
And then continuing Medicine Man, Rising Sun, First Night, Just Cause, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, and Finding Forrester. And apologies if we've missed any obvious films, so let us know if we've missed any of your favourites that Sean Connery has appeared in.
Yeah, and what we're going to do now is, in keeping with our rating room title, we're going to kind of go through some of our favourites of Sean Connery that were non-Bond films. So these are some that we've picked out that we personally like. So 5 apiece. Jay, do you want to go first with your 5?
Yeah, thank you. Well, actually, Andy, before I kind of go in, out of the films that we just listed there, were there any films that you've not seen? Or as doing the research of this, you think, oh, I haven't watched that, I'm going to watch that at some point?
There's quite a few, actually. I think
okay.
What this highlighted to me is just how little I actually knew about Connery outside of the Bond role. But of the ones we've listed so far, I haven't seen Medicine Man or Rising Sun, and dare I say I've not actually heard of Just Cause. So that's my bad.
Yeah, well, I've not seen Just Cause. I've seen the other one. The other ones. Medicine Man is the one where he's in something like the Amazon rainforest and he's looking for some plant or some kind of, in terms of developing some type of medication, some kind of drug. So I remember that because he had quite a white beard as well. And Rising Sun as well, from memory. I think that's the one he did with Wesley Snipes. And I think that was that set in Asia? or something. I would have to, maybe Japan, but I haven't seen that one for years. So I do think it is. Actually, Andy, I'm going to stop and just check that before, and then we can figure out, do we need to cut this completely out, because I am, oops, and Andy is seeing me type it in and just doing so many typos because I've got my light off and I'm typing in the dark.
Jay regularly uses his laptop in the dark for various reasons. But this is kind of the service you get here on the Rating Room. You know, live, in the moment, research, all for our listeners.
And there it is. I was right. Yes, with Wesley Snipes. I remember watching that as a kid, but I'm thinking more like a teenager watching that. And you can see there he is, Andy, on my screen. He's got I would say his typical beard as an older actor. And there's obviously Wesley Snipes, who obviously played Blade. So yeah, sorry Andy, I kind of went off there. So yeah, so my top 5 films, and this was, I think this is I found this a bit difficult, Andy, because, you know, in terms of the main podcast, we're rewatching the films each week, so the film is fresh in our mind, you know, in terms of when we're ranking these. So the 5 films that I've picked, obviously I've seen them, but some of those I've not seen for years and years and years, and try to remember and then think about the rankings was a bit difficult. But so kicking off, I put The Man Who Would Be King as number 1, and interestingly, Andy, that is one of my dad's favourite films. That is, and I remember watching that with my dad as a youngster as well, and I watched that a few times. That's a very good film if you haven't watched that one. The Untouchables is a classic, and Andy, I don't know, during COVID, during a pandemic, I had a big clear out of a lot of DVDs. I used to have hundreds and hundreds of DVDs, and I had the Untouchables. I can't remember if it was a special edition, but I had the Untouchables on DVD, and before I gave them to charity, I rewatched some of them, and then I kept a small number at home still, and I think that is one of the ones I kept because it's such a good film, obviously with Kevin Costner as well. The Hunt for Red October is a film actually I rewatched not too long ago. It's a film that is on one of the streaming websites from memory, and I was flicking through a few weeks ago, I think it was, and I enjoyed watching that again. I think that is a classic. The Rock is a classic, and the reason why I haven't put it any higher is I do like Nicolas Cage, but I think for me he probably knocked it down. If Sean Connery was the main character, maybe it would have scored a bit higher. But Nicolas Cage is one of those actors, the way I like him in some films, but I don't like him in all the films. Whereas, you know, you might have some actors that you will watch all their films. Him, I don't necessarily like all his films. And then I thought, well, you've got to have one Indiana Jones, haven't you, really, in there? So I've gone for Indiana Jones, The Last Crusade. And Andy, before I pass over to you, do you know about the theory about The Rock and James Bond? Have you heard kind of like the theories that you see on social media or online forums?
I have not, no. Please enlighten me.
Well, there's a kind of a theory out there that Sean Connery, his role is actually James Bond in that. Some people say that he's actually portraying James Bond in The Rock. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that. It's obviously not true, but there's fan theories out there that saying Sean Connery is actually playing James Bond in that role.
I've never heard that before, and now I want to watch it to see how true to life that could be, because that is fascinating. Because he's really good in The Rock, and he's obviously very crafty and very, very clever and can find his way around. And yeah, I guess you could argue if it could be Bond-esque, but I would need to watch it again to really take notice. But that's fascinating. Yeah,
I think, like I said, it's kind of Bond-esque. But I think if it was really, if we're saying, for me, I think James Bond would have managed to escape. I don't think he would have been held captive all those years. I think he would have managed to escape. Obviously, he escaped from Alcatraz, but he's obviously kept prisoner in other detention centres. I think if it was a real James Bond, he would have either seduced his way out, or Q would have gone and saved him, or someone.
He'd have had some sort of device on his person, like a pen, or there'll be something.
Yeah. So Andy, so that's my 5. Do you want to go over your 5 and see how different they are compared to my 5?
So I've tried, where possible, to not pick the same as you, but I've got a couple of overlaps. So I've gone with The Rock as kind of number 1. I absolutely love that film. I get your point about Nicolas Cage. I think Nicolas Cage films star Nicolas Cage as Nicolas Cage. I don't think he's got much depth. Apologies, Nicolas. You're a fine actor, but, learn to do something new. I've gone for Entrapment as well, which is a film that I really enjoyed, but I haven't seen for a very long time. But I remember really enjoying it at the time, so I figured that needs to be included. Highlander I've included as well. I think that's an absolute classic. Again, one I've not seen for a long time, but as a teenager saw many, many times. And just one of those cult classics. I've gone with Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. I think he's pretty good in that, actually, and I think his portrayal as the father of Indiana Jones has kind of a little bit cunning and clever, but also there's that kind of ditzy old man side to him, and I think is a nice balance, and I think him and Harrison Ford work really well together on that. And then I've cheated a little bit for my number 5 pick, and if I'm honest, if he was credited in this film, I'd probably put this to the top of the list because I absolutely love this film. But he has an uncredited cameo in Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. And if memory serves me correctly, does he play King Richard? He briefly appears at the end, doesn't he?
Yes, it is. I think it's the wedding, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah. The wedding of Robin and Marion. So it's cheating a little bit because it's not technically a Connery film, and his part in that film is very, very small. But I absolutely love the film. And I seem to recall it was the very first film I saw at the cinema. Back as a 6 or 7-year-old I would have been.
Ah, interesting. Do you know what my first film at cinema was?
Wizard of Oz, 1939?
You're not far off. Obviously not the year. Was Care Bears. And obviously I'm a few years older than you, and I remember this. So it was, I don't know when you went to the cinema in terms of if they still did it, but when I went to watch Care Bears as a kid, so I was still living down south, and I moved up when I was 6, so I must have been about 5. And even though it's a Care Bears film, I remember where they stopped the film and did refreshments. So I remember that, and I know that showed my age a bit.
I think that is, because I don't remember that ever happening to any film I've ever been to.
But I remember when moving up north, and I'd say the first film, I would say as a, still a kid, but the first one that really stuck out, that I remember going to the cinema and just thinking, wow, that's amazing. Like, really appreciating that whole experience was Jurassic Park. I remember watching that.
Yeah. We could do a whole episode on the films we've seen at the cinema and the experience of it, but we could talk for hours. Let's carry on with this then.
So Andy, just before we move on, you know how I love to kind of pick up these little relationships between various films. Obviously, The Untouchables that I mentioned with Kevin Costner, and you obviously picked out Robin Hood.
Yes, of course. Interesting as well, if we go back to earlier in the podcast, we talked about Connery playing... Did he play Robin in Robin and Marion?
Yes.
He did. So he played Robin Hood and then came back to the wedding of Robin and Marion in Robin and Prince of Thieves.
So he only needed to play Marion next to get the hat trick then.
Exactly.
Andy, so you said you didn't want to kind of duplicate some of like the entries on mine. So if you were picking, a complete top 5, and you could basically have any movie, and you could have replicated mine, and you might have changed the order because of bringing some new films in to talk about, what ones from say my list, or which ones from my list would have you included, or are you happy with your list in terms of if I didn't pick that one you would have picked it, or vice versa?
The Untouchables, I think that's a fantastic film. That would have probably gone in at number 2 instead of Entrapment, and Hunt for Red October would have been in the mix. So that's a decent film. That might have been like 5B or maybe 6, but certainly in the conversation.
Actually, during the pandemic, I bought the book of the Hunt for Red October, and it's sat in my unread pile of books, because whenever I watch a film that I know is a book, I think, I'll just jump on Amazon and then just that impulse, buy it, and then it's just sat there gathering dust. But I do want to read it at some point.
That's an interesting point, and I'm going to go off on a little bit of a tangent here. But are you one of those people that prefers to read the book after watching a film or a TV show, or do you watch a film based on a book? Because I tend to find when people read the book first, then they watch the film or TV show about that book, they're invariably disappointed because it's not the same. Whereas if you do it the other way round, I think it's less disappointing because you don't have that preconceived notion of what it should be.
I do both, and I give you a bit of an example. So I remember watching the first Lord of the Rings film, the first Harry Potter film, The Godfather. I remember, and other films, obviously I'm just picking out 3, where I watched the film and it actually made me want to read the books. And then, say for example, Harry Potter, obviously I think that initially did it come out every year, and then obviously there was gaps. So I remember watching that on DVD the first time, and then reading the books to catch up in terms of the ones that were released. Same with Lord of the Rings. I watched the first film at cinema, Lord of the Rings, and then I managed to read all 3 before the second film came out. And then after reading Lord of the Rings, I read The Hobbit, and then obviously years later they made The Hobbit. So yeah, I don't have a particular pattern in terms of I've got to read the book or I've got to watch the film. But I do find, because I don't know if you read much, but I suppose it helps watching watching a film, because you're talking about an hour and a half, 2 hours, and reading a book takes longer than that. So in terms of that commitment, you could watch a film and think, oh, it's rubbish, and I won't bother reading the book. But it's, as you know, films don't tend to include everything in a book as well. So it's nice to read a book and get all those extra bits that never made it quite into the film.
Yeah, I agree. Lord of the Rings is another example of mine. I watched the film, then started reading the books. I hated the books. Spoiler alert, if we ever do a Lord of the Rings series podcast, I hated the books. I say the books. I read the first one to the end and got so fed up with it, I thought I cannot read anymore. But the films I absolutely loved.
Do you count listening to an audiobook as reading a book?
I have never listened to an audiobook in my life.
I listened to them, and recently, like I said, I've read the books, I've watched the films, and I was just flicking through my Spotify, and I've listened to the Hobbit on audio, and I'm part way through the first book on audio. And I just wonder, because some people, where you just talk to them in real life, or you see stuff on social media, some people are adamant that they have read a book if they just listen to it. And then you get the opposite, where people say, you haven't read a book, you've listened to it, it doesn't count as reading a book. And I just wondered what your view was.
I mean, the technical definition I would say no. And having never listened to an audiobook, I'm a big podcast fan, but I've never felt the need or urge to listen to an audiobook. Do you just listen to it, or do you read along with it at times? Like you do back in school, where you've got one of the kids reading out the story and you're all following along. Is that a thing people do?
I don't know. I think they do. Oh, is it BBC? Do you remember at Christmas, where they have a famous actor reading a children's book? So they'll probably do that. But in terms of, now I do it when walking a dog or commuting, in terms of audio books. So it's one of, I don't think you can count it, because when you're reading, you're actively concentrating, whereas when you listen to an audiobook, you can kind of wander off, and there's chance of that you might miss things. I don't know when you read. Sometimes when I'm reading, I might read a page and then I realise my mind has wandered off, so then I have to reread it again because I'm not really taking it in. So you digest it a lot more when you're reading a book, whereas audiobook, like I said, there'll be some times where something's happened in an audiobook and I'm thinking, like, what happened to that character? And my mind obviously wandered, and they're dead or something, and I didn't really pick it up at the time because I was walking or driving, something like that. I just wondered what your view view of that is. I know we've kind of gone off topic, but it was linked into when you mentioned, like, when I mentioned Lord of the Rings and you mentioned Lord of the Rings and stuff.
Yes, we've gone 6 degrees of separation from Sean Connery, haven't we? Yeah, that's what we've done.
But yeah, and Andy, and before we kind of move on, Entrapment, is that the one with Catherine Zeta-Jones?
It is, yes.
Yeah. I have watched that, but I think that is a film I probably only watched once. So yeah, I didn't put that one in my. And Highlander is a classic. But yeah, no, I found it quite difficult but enjoyable. Have you watched The Man Who Would Be King?
I haven't. No, I've not seen that one.
That is a classic. So definitely worth watching.
Good. Let's carry on. So we've given our opinions on some of Connery's. We've given the opinions of his Bond films and his non-Bond films. Let's have a think about what the so-called experts think. So let's start with Rotten Tomatoes, shall we? So according to Rotten Tomatoes, the 5 top Connery films are, in order: number 1, Darby O'Gill and the Little People from 1959. Got a rating of 100%, an audience rating of 77%. That's a film I've never heard of, obviously very early in his career, but 100% rating, that says everything you need to know. Then we go to Goldfinger, 1964. This is his second best, 99% rating and an 89% audience rating. Followed by From Russia with Love from 1963, which got a 97% rating and an 84% audience rating. Number 4 was The Man Who Would Be King from 1975. Again, a 97% rating with an audience rating of 90%. And then at 5, we have Dr. No from 1962, which got a 95% rating and an 82% audience rating. So 3 of the top 5, according to Rotten Tomatoes, are Bond films.
I found that, I don't know whether I found it surprising. I found that interesting. And I have to stop saying interesting, Andy, because the wife was listening to the podcast and she says me and you say interesting a lot. So we're going to have to think of...
That's
we're going to have to,
like, she noticed that.
It's a shame when you're talking you can't do a right click and look for an alternative word. But I don't know if you find this, and I don't know if you use Rotten Tomatoes in terms of thinking, if you find a film and you think, you look at reviews or not, because I don't know how you go about it. I do look at Rotten Tomatoes to kind of get a general census, but I find a lot of the Rotten Tomatoes and IMDB seem to favour older films. So, and also, Andy, before you just come on that, interestingly, sorry, wife, the 3 Bond films that is in the top 5 of Rotten Tomatoes, 2 of them are in the same order that we've done. But Dr. No for them is higher than our 3rd place, which was Thunderball. Although Dr. No and Thunderball, in terms of both our rankings, we did score the same, but because we're not having joint positions, we have favoured Thunderball. So I think we're consistent with Rotten Tomatoes.
I tend to agree. I would say it's interesting, or I could say it's fascinating, or gripping, entrancing, beguiling, appealing, amusing, stimulating, riveting. There we go. We'll get enough words there.
I think that's very good. So Andy, what was my first question to you? I forgot.
Did you ask me a question? I can't remember now.
There were 2 points. I think my first point was that it favours older films. And actually, my first point was, do you use a reviewing site before you decide to watch a film to kind of get a general census?
Not always. I do. To be honest, I used to read the BBC reviews with the guy whose name escapes me.
Jonathan Ross?
No, I know who he is. He's a balding guy with glasses.
Not Mark Lamode.
Yeah.
Is it?
I think it might. Is it Kermode?
Yes, yeah.
Mark Kermode. So he used to do reviews on the regular. I don't know if he still does. But I used to read his reviews every now and again. But to be honest, these days I go to the cinema far less frequently than I used to, so I probably don't seek out reviews quite as often because I'm not a cinema goer much these days. But yeah, so the BBC ones I've looked in for, and then my go-to place for kind of information gathering is IMDb.
I agree. So for me, it's not so much about going to the cinema. For me, it's watching something on, say, Netflix, Prime, Disney Plus, etc. Especially films now are longer than an hour and a half, so you're committing roughly 2 hours on average. So unless it's a film that I see the trailer and think, yes, I've got to watch, or it's a film by like a director I like, an actor I like, or within, say, like a franchise. If it's a film or a TV series that I know nothing about, the trailer looks okay, I will jump onto, say, Google, IMDB, Rotten Tomatoes, and just see, what's it, what is a rough scoring. I don't read spoilers or anything like that. I look at the see marks out of 10 or marks out of 5. So I don't go into any kind of detail, just to think, yeah, I might watch spend 2 hours of my time on Friday to watch a film. So I do that, but obviously it's very personal reviews, and there are films that will be panned by critics but have high scores in terms of the audience, so you have to kind of like, it's personal taste as well. So I do take reviews with a pinch of salt, but there is using an example now, I noticed on Netflix the other day a limited TV series, and I thought, the trailer looks good. I went on to Google and read some reviews, and I think the scoring out of 10 was something like 3, and then the reviews were saying how boring it was, and they basically made, I think it was 6 or 8 episodes, and the comments, and I read the Guardian review actually, and people were saying basically they could have made it into a film. They just dragged it out to make a 6 or 8 part TV series, and it could have been done in like an hour and a half film. So I don't think I'm going to watch that one, because I don't want to commit to 6 or 8 episodes and not being very good. So yeah, I just thought I mentioned that. And yeah, I've out of those 5 that you mentioned, Andy, I've not seen Darby O'Gill and The Little People from 1959. So it's a film I've not watched, and I might watch it, considering Rotten Tomatoes has given it a rating of 100%.
Certainly one to check out, I would say.
Yeah, and moving on then, so I'm going to pick up the IMDB, Andy's favourite there, source of, movie information. I'm going to pick up the top 5 Connery films here. So Indiana Jones, 1989, has an IMDB score of 8.2. The Untouchables comes in at number 2 with 7.9, which is joint, actually, with The Hill at 7.9. And The Longest Day at number 4 at 7.8, and The Man Who Will Be King at 7.8. So, you're talking about, what's that, 0.4 points between first and fifth in the IMDb rankings. And when you look at that, so a quick cross check, it's interesting, and it's fascinating, Andy, that Rotten Tomatoes actually didn't have The Untouchables on that list, which I think is a standout film for Connery. And there's not much of an overlap, really. You've got the Man Who Would Be King, and just looking at that, I think that's the only one that matches out of the top 5 between IMDb and Rotten Tomatoes, isn't it?
Yeah, it's the only overlap, and interestingly, no Bond films on IMDb, where we've got 3 out of the top 5 on Rotten Tomatoes.
Yeah, and just for our listeners, in terms of what we're going to do when we've finished the 25 episodes of the main franchise, we're gonna do like an end of season episode, and we're going to bring through into our main episode the kind of IMDb Rotten Tomato reviews as well, and we're going to kind of see what they look like against our ratings for James Bond films. So that's a fascinating point, or something to look forward to. So moving, Andy, is there anything you want to touch on before we kind of move on to the next section?
No, I don't think so. I think what I would say actually is, without blowing our own trumpet, is you mentioned earlier about critics versus audience don't always necessarily match. And I think that's where this podcast does a service to the listeners, because we're not professional movie critics, as you will probably tell by the kind of things we talk about. We don't look at it through a lens of how was the cinematography or the sound editing or anything technical. It's simply based on what do we enjoy or not enjoy. And you may agree or disagree, and that's absolutely fine, but we're not going with any kind of bias or any kind of pre-notion. It's simply, what do we enjoy, we'll say, and what don't we enjoy, we'll also say.
And you won't find Nipple Watch on any of these professional websites or journalists either, would you, Andy? Which obviously we do talk about.
It's a key thing for any film. If I'm looking for reviews, I also want to see what's the nudity content, because sex and violence are two of the main things I look for in a film.
Yes, that's funny, because when we watch a film on a streaming website and it comes up at the beginning and it says, like, you know, trigger warnings, if it comes up with sex and violence, I always say to the wife, oh, this could be good. It's got all the main ingredients of, for the recipe of a good film. But Andy, yeah, I just think, so I think, we've mentioned that we're going to cover the IMDB Rotten Tomatoes at the end in our special episode in our main series, so we're going to touch on that. And Andy, before we kind of move on now to the next session, I just want to say again, I quite like that we took a bit of time and talked about some non-James Bond films in this episode. So it's the first time we've really dedicated any time, because obviously season 1's about James Bond, so we're focusing on that. So I do like how we've touched on some of these films.
There is a world out there that goes beyond Bond, and we are living proof of that right now.
So this next section, we're going to talk about what kind of awards and honours Sir Sean Connery has either been nominated for, and on several occasions he's also won. So we're just going to list some of the nominations and some awards. So Andy, do you want to kick us off?
Indeed, I'll start with the Oscars, Academy Awards. So Connery won Best Supporting Actor in 1987 for playing veteran police officer Jim Malone in The Untouchables. That's a pretty nice thing to have on your CV as an Oscar winner. Moving on, various nominations in the BAFTAs. He was nominated for Best Actor in 1987, also for playing William of Baskerville in The Name of the Rose, and he won the BAFTA for this. He was also nominated for Best Supporting Actor for The Untouchables in 87, Best Supporting Actor in 89 for Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade for his portrayal of Henry Jones Sr., and also for Best Actor in 1990 for playing Marco Aurelius in The Hunt for Red October. And in 1998, he received the BAFTA Fellowship Award, which recognises outstanding achievements, and it is the highest honour that the BAFTAs give.
And Andy is doing part of the research with this pod, and I used to watch the BAFTA, so I don't know if you, and with the Oscars, obviously, we're based in England, so you've got the time zone difference, so I never watch the Oscars live. I might watch various bits on, say, YouTube, social media. I always find it fascinating where you see different nominations across, say, the Oscars or the Golden Globes or BAFTA for, films and actors, where, for example, in 1987, he won an Oscar for The Untouchables, but for the same role in the same film, he was only nominated in the BAFTA. So I find it, you've obviously got different judges, so there might be different criteria, but I do find that quite interesting where you have, an actor might win an award for a particular film for one kind of awarding body, but then might not win it or might not even get nominated for that particular role. Golden Globe Awards. So Connery has been nominated for 5 Golden Globe Awards. These nominations were for the following. So he was nominated for the Henrietta Award. So that's kind of the World Film Favourite Male kind of category. And he had the nominations in 1965, 68 and 72. And he also won the award in 1972. And he was nominated, and he mentioned The Untouchables. So again, he got a Golden Globe nomination for The Untouchables, and he was successful, and he won that. And in Best Supporting Actor again in 1989 for Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. He also received the Cecil B. DeMille Award in 1995, which recognises outstanding achievements.
Yeah, and beyond that, there was some other awards to recognise his exceptional achievements in the arts. So in 1987, he won Commander of the Order of Arts and Letters in France. In 1999, he was awarded Kennedy Center Honours. He was given a knighthood by Queen Elizabeth II in 2000. the European Film Awards Lifetime Achievement Award in 2005, and the AFI Life Achievement Award in 2006.
So, as Andy mentioned at the top of the podcast, we're planning to record a bonus episode for each of the Bond actors. So, it's going to be interesting to see what the actors have achieved outside of the Bond franchise. And Andy, before you kind of close us off, thinking about your favourite Sean Connery films, we've obviously picked the top 5 non-Bond films. If you had the opportunity to pick from his whole film catalogue, in your top 5, would you think any Bond films would appear?
Definitely Goldfinger. I think that would be number 1 of all his films. But that might be the only one in the top 5, actually, because I've got a real affection for The Rock. I think that's an excellent film. And Highlander. There's maybe in the 4 and 5 slot Indiana Jones, and I use Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves as a bit of a cheat. So maybe there's some room for replacing one of those with From Russia with Love, potentially. But they'd probably be the only 2, I would say.
And another question, Andy. So this, we've not scripted this, and this is just a thought that I've had. If you think of Sean Connery, do you immediately think of Bond, or do you start thinking of, say, The Rock, Highlander? Because he's obviously had a successful career outside of James Bond.
So I think of him as Bond first and foremost, but I guess it's probably because I didn't see any of his films at the time he was Bond, so I kind of see that second phase of his career with films like The Rock and Hunt for Red October, etc., which came obviously a long time after he finished playing Bond. So in my mind, there's Bond, then there's a huge gap, then there's Old Man Connery, for lack of a better term.
So I suppose you could say, if he was a footballer, he's had a playing career, and then he's moved into a successful management career.
He's like Brian Clough, legendary striker in his day. Ended early because of injury, then went into being one of the best managers of all time.
And Andy, actually, before I finish, I just want to say some of the films that we mentioned Connery in, I didn't put in the top 5, but I just wanted to say this before we finish. Finding Forrester is a film that I had on DVD, which is a very good film, and is a film, I don't know if you do this, I can't remember if you ever discussed this, because I'm a bit sad and geeky. Sometimes I go on YouTube to rewatch particular scenes in films, so I don't watch the whole film, I just watch a particular scene. And I did find myself, after researching and doing this prep for this bonus episode, I went onto YouTube and I was watching the end scene in Finding Forrester, where Connery comes and does a talk in this university about the main character. So I don't know if you do something similar, if I'm just weird, basically.
Not so much, I'll be honest. Although I do like to read about mistakes and bloopers, and then try and find those, because as we've talked about on the main pod, we do spot the occasional blooper here and there. But when you go online, there are dozens and dozens that are maybe not so obvious. So I try and find those.
Yes, sorry, Andy. So, is there anything you want to say before we kind of sign off?
I think what I would say to our listeners is we'd love to hear from you. You've got all our social media accounts and details all via the website, and let us know what your favourite Sean Connery movies are, whether it's Bond or otherwise. And thanks for listening.
Well, that's this week's episode done. We hope you enjoyed it.
Special thanks to the band Sugar Tongue for the theme tune to The Rating Room. You can find them on all the usual social media channels, and be sure to check out their song The System, available now on Spotify.
You can find and message us on Twitter, Facebook, TikTok and Instagram by searching The Rating Room.
You'll find all our social media links on our website, theratingroom.com, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Or feel free to drop us an email at theratingroom@gmail.com. Goodbye, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week, right here on The Rating Room.
The Rating rain room. The rain room. The rain room.